A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, so welcome back to Ethics in Video Games, and this episode is going to be a little bit different in that we don't really have a specific issue to talk about or a specific game that we're going to talk about. Instead, what we're going to do is Shlomo has talked about his ideal game, a game that inspires players to think about ethical questions as they play. And I don't think this game has been made before, so that's very interesting to me. So I'm super intrigued. Shlomo, you're an ethicist. I'm the game designer. So I thought I'd lead you through the process of designing a game like this. So starting from like just a brainstorm session, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to get to a place where we sort of understand the scope of the game, that we could, if at the end of this hour, hopefully we'd be in a position where we could make a one sheet or a sell sheet for a game that did what you wanted it to do.
Though it's interesting, in thinking about this, because you wouldn't tell me anything that we were going to do, except that we were going to make this idea of my favorite kind of game. And,
well, I mean, you probably never played a game like this, right?
Well,
because there hasn't been one.
I think there are definitely some games that. So here's the way I would think about it. I would say that there are games that are pretty good at creating ethical reflection, but that's not their main purpose, right? They have a moral dimension, right? I'm thinking of, let's say, The Witcher 3, right, has a lot of stuff like this. Heavy Rain, which we talked about, has good stuff.
Any game that has sort of moral dilemmas posed to the player in the storyline or in
moral dilemmas or other kind of mechanisms that you can do to get the player to engage in ethical reflection, but that's not your main purpose in the game.
Right. And I don't know how many people are actually inspired to do that. Like the game is not, since it's not the main focus of the game, how many, it's sort of a thing that people who are inspired to do that anyway just might be inspired to do.
To me, a moral dimension is part of life. Right. So, I was in the playground with my son and talked to another dad, and he was a screenwriter. And I asked him, so how do you write about ethical dilemmas? And he said, I never really thought about it. I just write drama. And when we write drama, eventually, as we raise the odds, some of the challenges, some of the hard decisions always end up being moral decisions. Right. So morality in that sense is just kind of part of the regular part of life. So when I think of games with a moral dimension, I think, these are games that are trying to make kind of the narrative of someone's journey in many ways more realistic, because none of us take a journey without moral hazards of some kind.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, that especially, games that try to capture life are going to try to capture, or any sort of art, whether it's, film or drama or music or theater or anything that tries to capture life is going to, at some point, lend itself to these ethical questions. It's going to ask a moral question. It's going to ask an ethical question. But that's not its point. Its point is to tell a good story, to entertain you, and to do that. But there's a class of games. So most games are made for this sort of fun, right? The sort of generic idea of entertainment fun. But there's a class of games called serious games that are made for other things. They're not made to be fun. They're made to do other things. And so we might be talking about one of those games, but we might not. I still think that we can probably do something that has as its focus the kind of fun that you have sort of defined, which is it's fun for you to think about ethical things.
I think it's worth talking. We're talking just a few minutes, right, about this kind of stuff, right? So we can have the games that are just fun, and then the morality is this kind of extra boost, right? That just makes the whole thing more realistic, right?
Of course. Right? And we would expect that. I would expect that kind of thing from any really well-written game.
Yeah, right. I mean, if I'm playing an Assassin's Creed game, I'm expecting that at this point, right?
Exactly.
And I'm getting it, right?
Right.
But then you have these other games, and maybe these are the kinds of games that I'm personally really interested in. That are games that are trying to get you to really kind of think about an issue, right?
Yeah.
And reflect on it. For example, there's the game Orwell. I don't know if you've heard of the game Orwell. It's a game that came out a couple years ago where you play essentially as you're kind of helping do social media research / tracking of people for a government in the neighboring country, and you're helping to track terrorists.
Oh, right. Actually, we have talked about this, I think.
Oh, have we? Oh, great.
I think so.
Right?
Haven't we? This sounds familiar now.
Right, and it gets you kind of to think about government surveillance over social media,
right?
And the marking of people as terrorists. And over time, the game makes you kind of more and more reflect on these labels that we give people and the judgments that we make, to the point that by the end, you're really kind of asked to think about whether you really are for or against this idea of government surveillance.
Yeah.
Right? So
I think that's great.
I thought it was a really, really smart game. And, there's games that also kind of teach you and make you think about things like fake news, right? So, and in my class, when I have my students design games for their final, and we do whatever, we're doing something like, I'm assuming what we're going to do today, though I'm not sure what exactly we're doing. I have them come up with some sort of ethical issue that they want to explore in the game. So they want a game so this isn't our first category games where it's just meant to be fun. This is a game where it's meant to be a kind of interesting exploration of an ethical issue, and your job as a designer is to keep it interesting, but also get the player to think, to reflect.
Right.
And those are really, I think, the kind of games I'm personally right now most interested in.
Right. So good. Excellent. So that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to create that kind of game. We may make it issue-based, or we may make it more general.
Okay.
We'll see how this goes.
All right. I'm nervous. All right, let's do this.
So this hypothetical game that we're going to make. So we're going to basically just describe this game. Ideally, at the end of it, we could have enough to make a pitch deck. But the first thing that we tend to do one of the things I like to do as a game designer, one of the things I like to do is create at the very beginning what I call the touchstone document.
Okay.
And the touchstone document basically says, it's just a few paragraphs, a couple of bullet points. What is it that we're trying to do? Regardless of any other design decisions we're making, what are our goals? And so we write down, we know, the one thing that we know we want to do is make a game that asks people to make ethical decisions, or to think about and inspires people to think about ethical decisions. So we know that. So we'll put that down in this touchstone document, right? And then that would be every design decision we make after this, we'll go back and say, does that design decision forward this idea?
Okay.
And then, and we would also, as a game company, if we were making a game, we would also we'd have to have decisions about who is this for? What platform is it going to be on?
Sure.
And so we might touch on those as well today too, just because that might help us sort of guide and define what this idea is.
Okay.
Right. So we've got a goal. We have a creative goal, right?
I'm still not entirely sure about that goal. So the goal is to have ethical reflection in the game.
We make a game. So this brings us sort of to the next sort of topic, the sort of general idea that I wanted to discuss, and that is what we're talking about is an aesthetic goal.
Okay, an aesthetic goal. Okay. So
there's a framework for a lens for looking at games called MDA. It's very academic, created by a trio: Robin Hunicke, Mark LeBlanc, and Robert Zubek. About 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And their idea was that as players, we experience the game in the reverse order from the designers who make the game. So as
Okay.
players, we have an aesthetic experience when we play the game that is created by the dynamics that the runtime of the game creates these game dynamics that happen.
Right.
And those game dynamics give us fun or whatever it is that the game, whatever aesthetics that the game gives us. The dynamics are created by the mechanics. So that gives us MDA, mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics.
Okay.
So we can, by sort of understanding that and sort of looking at that through the lens, we can go, okay, well, what are the aesthetics goals that we want to provide? And I think that the interesting thing here for me, and I think for you, is we want a game that inspires you to think about these ideas.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
definitely.
that's our aesthetic goal.
Right.
So then we just sort of backtrack and go, well, what kind of dynamics do we need to have? Does the game need to have in order to do that? So now we can start to look at these other games, the games that you have played, the games that do this already, like Orwell or like, Papers, Please, or like, other games that say, all right, well, how do they do this?
Right.
So we'll sort of start there. What do you think? Like, what makes Orwell work?
Well, there's a bunch of things, and I think there's a lot of There's a lot of techniques, right, that you can use to create ethical reflection. Particularly, Orwell does something that I think would fall under It presents you into a scenario. It puts you into a kind of familiar scenario where you're like, okay, I get it. There's terrorists, right? There's been a bombing that's happened. The government is looking for people to help, and I'm getting a job, and I understand I'm going to help the government, right? Mm-hmm. And that puts you in a position in a storyline that you're familiar with. You understand the kind of idea. But later, it problematizes, right, your assumptions about the world. And, your assumptions, are you the good guy or the bad guy? Right? Are the bad guys really bad guys? Is the government right? So one of the assumptions that's being questioned is who really is good and bad here, right? And who should we really get the facts from?
Yeah.
Right? To the point where by the end it also makes you choose between those sides, right? So it represents it. It gets you to buy into the game, and then it starts making you feel like you need to question your reality, right? Mm-hmm. And then it also makes you choose, which I think is good, right? Because you kind of forcing you to choose is always something that's going to create reflection if you've got enough going on by that point.
Right. It's actually doing something that's very similar to what I'm doing in one of my superhero sit-down role-playing games, where in the premise of the game, the heroes there's a new team being formed to protect the west coast of the United States, and it's being funded by Homeland Security, and they have they have a general or a lieutenant general who they report to for Homeland Security, and they're left to do pretty much what they want to do, but periodically Homeland Security will come in and ask them to do some things, and which is great, right? It's just the premise.
Right.
And over time, they realize that every time that they capture a supervillain, Homeland Security comes and takes the supervillain away.
Where do they take him to, and what are they doing to that supervillain?
Right. So the premise becomes problematized, right?
Right.
The premise, the setup of the show, or the setup of the game, the setup of the story, is something that over time starts to become a little like, wait a minute, what's actually happening here?
Right, and to do this well, right, the game can prompt you in various ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, it gives you a little bit of information, just little dribbles of information,
right?
Which at first is great. They're helping you. They're providing information that you need. They're providing information you need. Now they're like, oh, you realize that there's a pattern, and the pattern is kind of problematic.
Right. Though of course this is just one way to do it, right?
Sure.
There's lots of ways, right, to kind of do this kind of thing, whether it's more straightforward or not. But I do like this particular way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this particular way, I feel like it's sort of a classic.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. Okay, so that's one way. Let's talk about another way. Other ways that we can create this sort of
Experience or aesthetic,
the
right?
aesthetic, right? What are some
Well,
other things that happen that happen in games that make you feel this way?
well, I think since you mentioned Paper Please, where we could talk about
Hmm.
Paper Please, right? I recently had a student come up with an idea for a game that took Papers Please. So Papers Please, for I'm assuming most of our listeners don't know it, is kind of a classic game. I think at this point, where
Yeah, I think it's about 10 years old now.
oh, it's only 10 years old now. Okay.
Won all kinds of awards when it came out just because it's so interesting. It's got a real low res graphic look. You're meant to be in the height of the Cold War, so it has a sort of a 1980s graphics look.
Right, and you are essentially you're the gatekeeper at the border, right?
Yeah, you're a border guard.
If you've ever been, at that passport line and you felt a little nervous whether that person was gonna let you in or create problems for you or take you into that little room, that's that guy. That's you, and you're doing it in, let's say, a Soviet era kind of East European place.
Right.
And
It's meant to be some sort of fictional Eastern Bloc.
right.
You know, recently, yeah. I guess it would have to be some sort of like Soviet Bloc country, right?
Right. And,
Yeah.
it's very authoritarian and your family's very poor and you really need this job and you got to help them. But according to the rules that you need to use to decide who gets to go in or not, you are going to essentially have to do some pretty bad things. So the game itself is very simple in terms of letting you choose. Are you going to let somebody in or not? Are you going to give them the stamp their passport or not? Yes or no? It's a
Right.
very binary, very simple choice, and the game just keeps throwing cases at you that are kind of morally questionable cases.
Right. So recurring cases
Right.
of people that it also presents you with people who come to the border every day, and their stories change. You start to get to know these other characters that they show
Right.
up.
Right.
So there's like this continuity. You start to get a sense of who you are and what the people are like and what the people are facing. Another thing that game does, which is interesting, is it puts you in kind of survival mode.
Right.
You are not making enough money to feed your family.
And that's your primary, that would be like the game rewards, right? Is all
Mhm.
about survival, and your job in the game is to survive. You need to feed your family, right? Get the medicine, but
Right, and that's kind of the pressure for you to do unethical things, like accepting
Exactly.
bribes.
accepting bribes, and also the unethical things of, let's say, saying no to people who, if they don't come in, let's say, are going to die, like
Right.
like refugees. So the mechanic there is very simple, right? There's a clash between, let's say, what the game rewards would be like, and what presumably you would want to do as a decent person. It also is nice that you can understand the pressures of survival, of having to take care of your family, right?
Yeah.
So you're not like the bad guy, and it provides you with moral dilemmas, not constant moral dilemmas, but moral dilemmas that come to your work in a way where no matter how you answer them, there's no clear good or bad, or rather, there's no
Right.
clear right answer to them, right?
Right. And I think that's super important. What you said right there is that these things, unlike a tactical question where you make a decision and you find out if you're right,
Right.
a moral question, you make a decision and you don't know.
Right. So these tactical questions, there's an optimum, let's say, in Papers, Please, is probably an optimum way that you can make choices that will help your family survive, right?
Right.
But there's no optimum way to make moral decisions, right?
Right.
That just doesn't exist.
Right. The game, if you could suss out the designer's goals, you might be able to, like, backwards like work out what the correct answers to everything is in order to but then you're gaming the game, right? You're not really playing the game, and you're not really making ethical choices. You're just trying to beat the game.
I'm not sure that you could even. I'm not sure you can even game that part of the game. The designer can be just, look, I created a bunch of scenarios I wanted you to think about.
Right.
That's about it. I mean, that's, there's no.
Well, I'll tell you this: if the designer wanted you to get to the 20th scenario, then he has a vested interest in making sure that you make it through the 19th.
Okay, right. Fair enough, right? So it's not like the designer just throws, here's a bunch of ethical questions, right?
Right.
Right.
But they do make sure that you can get through it.
Right.
Right. They may not know exactly the best way to get through it. That's frequently the case with the games I make, is I don't know the best strategies.
Right.
But I know that people will figure them out.
Okay.
Right, which actually brings us to another thought. So I've been reading about a game called Daisy, or Days, D-A-Y, capital Z.
Right, Daisy, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know if it still exists or not. I've been reading about stuff that happened in like 2014.
Oh yeah, it's on Xbox Live.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I guess it's a game that also puts you in this sort of tight survival mode.
Right.
And because you're in this sort of tight survival mode, you end up making choices that are not necessarily always the most ethical choices. And that brings you to think about whether or not you should be making these choices, right?
And this happens a lot with zombie apocalypse games.
Yes.
Right. So this is why The Walking Dead is so good, so good. The Walking Dead is constantly about survival and our group versus other people. And what are we willing to sacrifice for survival?
So tons of ethical questions, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I think that there might be like a simple hook, right? That maybe the game needs to have be tight, like in terms of like surviving the game, because it's quite hard in Papers, Please too. It's quite hard to survive the game.
Right. So this is a common one. The same would be for This War of Mine.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, the game in This War of Mine, it's another survival game. You're a civilian caught in a siege of a city in a war, and you can only go out at night, and you need basic supplies. It's a very, very hard game and a fantastic game. And as you go out to get supplies, you have to do pretty bad things to get those supplies, and your people get depressed over it and ashamed of what they do. And so. That's one way to do it.
That's interesting too. With the non-player characters, these characters you interact with have a moral dimension to them as well.
Oh, because they're representing real people, and real people care about decency, right? Real people care about you living up to their values. But notice we've got so far we've got two different frameworks, and there's others as well, right? The one is the survival one, where the pressure comes from survival, and the other one essentially, it is less direct in a sense, right? So Orwell was less direct. It's kind of the morality of the situation creeps up on you, right, much more slowly.
Right. How does Orwell? Because I haven't played Orwell. How does Orwell handle your survival? How do you lose?
You have a job to keep, right?
Okay.
So I mean, it's questioned about how are you going to say no to your boss if you want to say no to your boss.
And if you lose your job, is the game over?
Yes, but it's not. Okay. But you're not like in danger of losing your job, because you're not even thinking about losing your job, because you don't think there's anything wrong with your job for a very long time.
Oh, so there's no real lose condition in that game. You don't lose a lot. It's not a real tight game for surviving.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So surviving is really not the issue here.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Well, that's good to know, because I was starting to see a pattern amongst all the others.
Yeah, I think. Look, I think the surviving one is really kind of easy, right? I mean, this is a really easy hook, and I think you see it in tons of movies too. Right? Mm-hmm. You put people under pressure. What's the easiest way to put them under pressure? Intense danger, survival.
Right.
And that's where they got to make the tough decisions, right? Because the stakes are as high as you can get with survival.
And it's also dovetails very nicely into the player's goals, because the player's goals, regardless of what their character is, the player has a goal of playing the most of this game, or playing this game as much as they can. So anything that you do to truncate that is going to be seen as a punishment.
Right.
Right? Because I want to keep playing this game, and now I'm being kicked out of the game.
That's right. You have a conflict between the reward structure that the game gives you, right, and the personal reward structure that you get for being moral. So being moral punishes you according to the game reward structure. Right.
So I'm glad to know that this Orwell doesn't have that. Doesn't, like, you can just keep playing it, and it doesn't punish you. It doesn't punish the player that way.
Right. And and of course there's kind of, there's other ways to go where, for example, one thing about this whole survival issue is that it takes away from the everyday ethical issues. And sometimes what's really interesting is just the kind of everyday stuff that we do. Right. And you say to yourself, oh, okay, look, I'm never going to be stuck in a zombie apocalypse. Right. Okay, you asked me to make these difficult choices, but whereas in, let's say, a game like Orwell or a game like Life is Strange, which I think is really, so Life is Strange is a very narrative driven. You're a photography student in an arts college. You get these powers to turn time back. You're trying to solve a mystery, and that mystery essentially has to do with college stuff. Really at the end. And it involves things like, how do you treat someone who is in the quad and they're alone and they're kind of sulking and you don't really know them? Are you going to approach them, right? What do you do if someone writes like, bad things about someone on the bathroom mirror, right? What happens if there's a scene where you try to talk a friend down from jumping off a roof, right? So, not that, let's say, that one is an everyday exact thing, but there's lots of things in there that are really interesting because they do have to do with things like friendship, with things like the small things we all face.
And I would say that game took as its aesthetic focus this idea that they wanted to create a game that had they wanted people to be inspired to think about social problems. Like interpersonal social problems, not like society-wide social problems, but interpersonal social problems. How do I make friends? How do I keep friends? What do I do when my friends are mad, sad? What do I do when my friends are about to do something dangerous?
And part of that is, when you have interpersonal relations, you have interpersonal responsibilities. Right. So you can't have a game about interpersonal relations without really incorporating interpersonal responsibilities. Otherwise, you don't have a realistic, model of the world.
That's right, and persistent relationships with these characters too.
Yeah, you can't just drop them and ignore them.
Right. Or
at least not without consequences.
Whatever decision you make with them today is going to come back to you at some point, probably.
Right, because people don't let it just drop that you just ignore them for 3 weeks.
Right. So actually, that game is actually a really good example of another thing too, which we'll get to the first design, because we haven't actually designed anything yet. We just started talking around
let's do this.
But we're going to get there, and we're going to get it this way. They chose this sort of aesthetic goal, and then they chose a setting and a character for the player that fit that aesthetic goal.
Okay.
So, their aesthetic goal was, let's recreate the interpersonal relationship, society, social problems that people have. What's a cauldron? What's a good place for that? Or like a boarding school, a high school boarding school, when everybody's, at their most like dramatic, their most hormonal. This is where these kind of situations come up the most, and people feel them the strongest. So that'll be where we set the game. And it was a great decision.
Right.
So if we're going to do something similar with an ethics game, what is our setting? What is our character?
Right.
What is?
So that would, when I think about it, would totally depend on, what kind of issue. So let me kind of, again, pause on this because, right, when we reflect on ethics, we usually reflect on something, right? So one of those things can be, in Life is Strange, it's interpersonal relationships, right? In Papers, Please, hopefully it's the bigger issue of immigration that you really kind of think about.
I don't know if that ends up being the case.
That's what I would hope for, right?
Right. I don't think that's what I ended up thinking about when playing Papers, Please.
Maybe not, and it's interesting, right? And to me, that is an opportunity lost because a game like Papers, Please, right, can get you to think, oh wow, it's really interesting that I have to make all these hard decisions, and that's interesting. But what is the point of? Look, interesting is fun, and
sure,
right,
yeah, of course,
and but for me playing that game. I think of all the times I stood in line and was worried about the few times I have been pulled into rooms by by those people. I think of I thought of I had a flight once from Latvia to Holland with a guy who was who was from Nigeria but was living in Ukraine and was trying to get to someplace other than Ukraine. And he just happened to kind of make it on this flight. And when we were in line to get at the border, and he got turned away and taken into the room and deported. And and I think of all those kinds of decisions. He was kind of fleeing racism in Ukraine as a black man. And as I was playing Papers, Please, I was thinking of all the people I've known that have gotten deported, of how hard it is, and I'm an immigrant, right? So I think about these things, a lot more. And if they don't get you to think about that part, I think they really lost an opportunity.
Right. Well, I don't know that that was their intention. I think their intention was absolutely to have you think about ethical things, like whether to accept a bribe. But frequently, the characters that were coming by were characters that come by every day, so they're not immigrating. They're just crossing the border, like it's meant to be like the border between East Germany and West Germany. People cross that border every day, even during the height of the Cold War.
Right. Though of course, yeah, and you're on the east side, so you don't need to worry about people running away. Well, sometimes you have to worry about people running away to you. So it's not exactly an analog. But again, notice, right? If the point is, the point could be that you're thinking about a social problem, and social problems have so many angles. So if you're thinking about, immigration, right? There's so many. You can make the questions so that they explore, or the scenarios explore different aspects of the immigration experience.
Okay, so let me bring this back to the game.
Okay.
Is there any role or any premise or any situation where somebody has to think about and make ethical choices every day about a single thing?
Yeah.
About a single issue.
So, which is interesting because this is like Papers, Please. I was actually thinking yesterday I talked with my class about Facebook.
Okay.
And Facebook, I think about those, the monitors for Facebook. And that decide, what stays in, what doesn't stay in. Right? Man, they are, Facebook is in the public crosshairs right now. For very good reason. I think, their job is very difficult, but very, very important. They've been doing it with very mixed results, in my opinion, deciding what goes in, what doesn't go in Facebook. Someone like a Facebook, censor, and, full disclosure in case this matters. I tried to boost one of our episodes on Facebook, the one on virtual murder versus virtual pedophilia, and Facebook rejected it. Right. And I'm thinking here, okay, how do you justify this? Who is the person that's doing this? That was probably an algorithm, but it might not have been an algorithm, or the algorithm goes
Right.
to a person. So I'm fascinated by the ideas of these kind of people who work for Facebook who get to decide what stays and what doesn't stay in.
Okay, but are those aren't really ethical questions. Those are really policy questions. Those are like looking at something and seeing whether it fits a policy.
Well,
Like, is this thing the thing that the policy is meant to eject, or is this thing a different thing? That feels like a categorization issue less than an ethical issue. That's like, is this a square block that fits into the square hole, or is it a round block that happens to also fit into the square hole?
so you could be asking yourself, is this hate speech? Facebook has a policy against hate speech. Is this
Right.
hate speech? Does this fit into it? In a sense, that's true. There's tons and tons of ambiguity with
Right,
that.
and of course, the more you know about hate speech, the more likely you are to accurately identify hate speech. Right. I mean, that's been one of the
Maybe.
problems with them using algorithms to just look for keywords because the keywords don't necessarily understand the context. And so you, as a real person from a culture, understands the context of hate speech that people outside the culture don't know, and wouldn't experience it as hate speech at all.
Definitely. Though, of course, every culture has various subcultures, and if you which would interpret things differently. And of course, with things like hate speech, there are, and I think we've talked about this before, right? There's lots of interpretations, even if you have a definition of what that definition really means and how it really applies. I think even with a situation like this, where you're supposed to follow the policy, you can question the policy. You can question it in different ways. You can find ethical issues in the way the policy is applied as you're trying to apply it. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, that's just one possibility. Just because I happen to be thinking about about Facebook, mind you, of course, you could be a Facebook policymaker, right? And be going.
I think that's more interesting for sure.
Sure,
because that's where you're actually making the ethical decisions. Although it's also tainted, I don't know if that's the right word, with the business decision, right? Is this going to harm our business?
So, so as we're recording this, it's this past week, I think it's been during the last week, that the new independent ethics oversight panel that Facebook took together, which seems like a really, really good, actually, independent panel to me.
I'm all for it.
Right. What they call the Facebook Supreme Court, right, has essentially decided that Facebook, let's say, can be justified in kicking Trump out permanently, but they can't do it without giving good reasons for it. And they kind of like made Facebook go back and they got to give good reasons for it. Now, you can imagine being on that oversight committee, right? And that there's a lot of pressures when you are in that committee. Now, one of those pressures, people sometimes talk about corporations as having financial versus moral interests. Mm-hmm. But the financial interest of a corporation is if you are, let's say, if you work for Facebook, you are an agent of the shareholders that own Facebook, right?
That's right.
So you have fiduciary responsibilities to make the money. And those are ethical responsibilities to make the money. So what you're really doing is,
I don't know. That's is that ultimately true, or is that only true in capitalism?
Oh, if certainly it's true in capitalism, right? Certainly, okay. And I mean, it's literally the case. If you're management for a company, and it's a publicly held company, you have a responsibility to make money for the shareholders.
Right. You have a legal responsibility for sure.
Yes, and we typically think of it also as a moral responsibility. You're taking their money, you're using their money. They gave you their money to make them more money. Right. So
it's certainly it's probably even within the contract. It's probably a contractual obligation as well that this company, and I'm the head of the company. I have accepted this money from an investor this investor thinks that I'm going to do this with this money and wants this kind of return. They know that there's a risk that it might not work, but they don't think that I'm not going to do that with the money, right? I've told them what I'm going to do with the money.
Right. Though it's interesting. So there's different models, and I wanted to do an episode on corporate social responsibility and to apply it to video game companies and to see if we look at these kind of models differently, how we might see video game companies in a very different light. But let it suffice for now to say that, normally we take it that a firm does have some responsibility to make money for its owners.
Right. And it would be unethical for it to do basically a bait and switch.
Right.
To get the money selling one thing and then go and sell something else.
So imagine, I invested in your company, and I invested so that your company will make me money, and instead you decide to go make a big political stance, right? And that causes you to lose money, and you just took my money in order to make me money, and what you're doing has nothing to do with making me money.
Right. Or even if I give you money to sell mangoes and you decide to go sell bananas instead, I might be that also is a breach of my trust.
Oh,
right. You're not doing the thing that you
switch.
Yeah, you even though you're making me money, you're not doing the thing that you said you were going to do.
I see. Yeah, right. So it's not just about the money. It's also, what did I buy into?
Right.
Which is a great question. Again, let's bring it. Let's again table this until we can have an episode about it.
Let's get it back to the game.
Okay,
so I don't know that being one of the Facebook moderators is the right way to go, but being one of the Facebook policymakers might be a really good way to go.
Let's explore it. Let's see if it goes anywhere interesting.
Okay. So, all right. So we have a premise. And now I think we should think about the players.
Okay.
Who are we fictionally? We've got that as part of the premise. Is there going to be some sort of strong narrative? Is there some other aspect of the premise that heightens up this aesthetic that we want to get to? Is this? Are we setting this up in some sort of regime? Are we, setting up a company like this and creating policy for this in America might be different than it is in, say, some communist regime from the 1980s.
Right. Right. So are we creating an analogous situation? Or are we dealing with sorry, maybe another way to put it is, are we creating an analogy that's obvious, or are we creating an analogy that's not very obvious?
Right.
Right. In both cases, right, you want an analogy. God, we could do it both ways. Fictional countries I think are nice because right, they apply to potentially everywhere. The real world, though, allows the real world complexity of politics in.
Ooh, what about this? How about this? We're starting small. We're in a single country. It could be a fictional country or it could be a real country, but
awesome.
it's an analogous world to ours in any case. Right. And then as our company grows, we're going to expand into other countries with other cultures. And now we have different ethical questions to think about.
Right, other cultures, and I think if our first country could be very homogenous, right, that makes it really simple, right?
Yeah.
When you get cultures that are very very mixed, like American culture, right? You start getting a lot more diversity, which creates complications.
Right. So we're going to start in a country like Sweden, which has an enormously, even though it's starting to diversify, but it's still like 95%, cultural Swedish.
Sure. A little less than that now, but yeah.
Yeah.
And then my other kind of question would be, I'm torn between having you. I feel like I would want a narrative of some kind. I would want a lot of media engagement. And what I mean by that is reflections from the media about the choices that you're making.
Oh, that's good.
Right. I think reflections from the media a lot of times are really good because they're a way of kind of giving you feedback and making judgments, whether they're fair or not, about what you're doing. And I think it really helps for ethical reflection to have a lot of people judge you. Right?
Yes.
And from a variety of perspectives.
Right. And those perspectives can have biases as well, and have different biases, which are also interesting. Right.
And a way to kind of hopefully maybe slightly alert you to those biases, or maybe alert you to those biases in some way. The other thing I'm wondering is whether this would be one person, single player game, or if there's a way to make this multiplayer game where all the people in the oversight committee are players,
right?
Which would be a lot harder, but in some way really cool.
Yeah, in some ways it could be done with the idea of when we play multiplayer games, we're playing on servers, and the servers can be as big or small as we like them to be.
Right.
So it could be that when you join this game, you join a multiplayer server, and that maybe that's a maximum of 12 people on the server, right? And that's the council,
right? And the nice thing,
and you're together making these decisions, and you have to vote on them, and you have to pull in all this information, and each of you can go and get more information to bring back to the others.
Right, and now you have what is partly a simulation, right, of what happens in real life, and to me, this is what I love about games, and this is why I find games like this so interesting. Because when I talk to my students about these kinds of decisions, we talk in the abstract. That said, I have a workshop that I do where we simulate being in a business oversight committee for companies like Google as they're trying to deal with censorship requests from different countries, which is another one of these that companies like Facebook have to deal with. And then they're in their groups, and they actually have to make decisions on this. And, you learn so much better. But, of course, that's in an organized classroom. In a game where you can actually be with other people, preferably from all over the world.
Right.
Like this, it would be really interesting to see where people take it.
Yeah. Especially as people come and go, you're going to get different voices too, right? So, it could be that after a while you decide to move to a different server, or somebody else, quits the server and stops playing, and that slot becomes open, and you get another person in, and now you have a different voice on the council.
And that happens in real life.
That happens all the time.
Right?
Of course, it happens. Right? It happens, every day in people's workplaces. There's a new hire comes in, and now the social dynamics have to change and shift.
Right.
And
they come
you have
in
to
with
make
a very different perspective that you now have to deal with.
Right. And a lot of companies are actively trying to create this diversity too. They realize that the people are the same, that they're basically hiring friends of friends of friends of friends of friends, and all the people are basically have come in with the same viewpoints.
Right. And we can see, right, for an issue like this is actually a pretty good issue to illustrate, right? What's the problem with not having diversity in boards like this, right? That, the more perspectives you have, the more insight you're getting into the full dimension of the issue that you're exploring.
Right.
And the more you're challenged.
Right. Okay. So this is good. Now I want to talk about choices. And I want to ask, there's a specific question that I have for you. If we want people to make ethical choices, do we need to give them the ability to make unethical choices? That is, if we want them to think about ethics, do we need to give them the ability to make unethical choices? A lot of the games that we've talked about do, right? You can make unethical choices in Papers, Please. You can make unethical choices in Orwell.
Right.
You can make,
I would say that you don't have to. I would say that that's the most obvious way to do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? The most obvious, I mean, the super most obvious way is to give you, here's a good, here's a bad, here's, the Paragon and the, God, I forgot what the other one is on Mass Effect. Right?
Right.
The good and bad choice, right? The black and white choice. But we're not doing that because we're better than that. Right.
Right.
So,
right.
but
I
we
think
do.
we have a richer. The premise is richer for it for sure. I don't know that there's any way to can we offer people bribes? I guess to make unethical choices in the.
Right. So we're not going to go there. And we're not having the survival kind of issue, right? That's going to push us to have to do it. But so the obvious way would be to create moral dilemmas, in which you're choosing between, let's say, the lesser of two evils, right? That's kind of the. And notice the lesser of two evil doesn't mean that you need to have the unethical to do the ethical. Both could be. You're looking for the right thing to do, and the right thing to do might still be wrong in some ways.
Right. And we're providing feedback to as to consequences for their choices via these media reports.
Right. So the media reports are one way. Judgments from other players are other ways.
Mm-hmm.
Judgment from the public. Judgment from other people. So the more feedback you're getting on your judgment, the more there's consequences, of course, of dealing with the social milieu, and of course, real world consequences, right? So if you make a choice, and let's say we are going to allow this white nationalist, to stay on the platform, and all of a sudden we have a malicious situation that's happening where 4 people die, right? That's part of the consequences that might come with it. But that's not the only way to do it, right? It's also possible to have small, and these are kind of like the obvious decisions, but there's also sometimes small situations where you're not really faced with a kind of obvious dilemma, but you kind of have the option to do something nice, something good, right? No one's making you do it, right? But it's there, it's available to you.
Can we build some of that into this game? How would we build that into this premise? That one might be tricky. I think it's a good idea, though.
That's interesting. So if we are taking on the harder task of making this a multiplayer game, which I think is harder and in many ways more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I've never played a game like that. That sounds awesome. I'd love to try playing a game like that.
Yeah.
So if we've got multiple players, definitely some of the things that we might do that might be just, you're not faced with an obvious choice, but it would be nice for you to do this, and it would be moral for you to kind of do this. There's a
simple way especially when you're dealing with actual real players, is just compliments, right?
Right.
And can we institute some sort of this is a hypothetical game, so of course we can, some sort of text recognition algorithm that recognizes when people are complimentary to each other.
We could, if we want to count the morality or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's one possibility, giving things to other people in a way that is not, in a way that is somehow beneficial. It would depend on the context. Maybe you're making a choice and you have the option of informing. So let's say this decision that Facebook had to not allow me to boost my post. They could have also offered an explanation, but they didn't.
Right.
They don't have to. It's their company. Do they own
and I know exactly why they didn't.
Because it's an algorithm and the robots did it.
Well, and as a policy, I know why they didn't, because they know that there's a large enough fraction of the people who will argue the point.
Right. So it keeps it simpler for them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe they could have done it, and maybe that would have been, they're giving up on that simplicity, and to do what they think would be kind of the more responsible thing to do. Right. And maybe that's an option. Right. Those are kind of the immediate things I think about. I think the number one thing is being respectful and nice to the people on your panel, though,
Mhm.
as you said,
Mhm.
right? And you're there on a professional basis. You don't have to be
Mhm.
nice, right? You have to be
And
cordial. Right?
and there could be a way of how do we let players do that? How do we, within the agency of the game, um, let people feedback on whether or not other people have been cordial and nice to them? Because we don't necessarily know, right? As the game doesn't necessarily
Right.
know if you're being nice to me. Like Zoom right now doesn't know if I'm being nice to you.
Right, right, right. Well, it's interesting. When I'm thinking about the kind of decisions that you would make,
Mm-hmm.
right? These are potentially the kinds of decisions that people might be passionate about,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or some people might be passionate about. When a vote is taken, maybe a vote is taken and you're on the winning side,
Mm-hmm.
right? Can we give some sort of option? At that point of how you relate to the losing side,
Mm-hmm.
that might be the sort of thing that might count,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah, it's interesting because in a single, again, in a multiplayer game, I feel like so much of it is left to regular social dynamics
Mm-hmm.
that it's harder to think of specific things. But the more we get into specifics of the game itself, the more I think it's we can find more things like this.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is where the meat of the game is, right? The meat of the game is you join this group of people, and maybe it could be super asynchronous too, right? Where it's happening in real time, but not everybody's playing all the time. So
Mm,
people are logging. It's basically a chat room, but you're able to bring in information from other parts of the game. So you could go in and find media. You could find information about the people that you're making decisions about. You could, like, there's a world of the game that you can go out and research, but you're
I
bringing that
see.
in and you're bringing it back to the council. And then at some point there's going to be a vote. There's some question to the council.
Right.
And then at some point there's a vote, and then how you have behaved during all of this is factored into some sort of score of your own.
Right.
And you want to do well because that's what you do as a player. As a player, I want to do well in a game. So how do I know that I'm doing well? I need to have some sort of feedback to whether I'm playing the game well.
Oh, well, it's interesting. So your feedback here could be how respectful you've been to your committee.
Exactly.
Though it's interesting. Of course, could be so many reasons for playing a game like this.
Mm-hmm.
My reason would be partly to kind of educate myself on these things, but I think for many people would be to kind of, make make the right decisions, convince other people to do the right thing. Where you don't win by being nice, you win by getting it right. Right,
Mm-hmm.
you win by making change happen.
Mm-hmm.
So you could be the nice guy that let Facebook censor things it shouldn't censor, right? Or vice versa, right? So it's interesting. I'm not
So
exactly sure how that would be.
yeah, and we could count both of those things, right? We could count, how much people enjoy working with you by some metric that we haven't yet figured out.
Well, that
Or
metric could be subjective rating.
we could also measure how many times that you have posited that you have been the one to call for a vote, and if you're the one calling for the vote and you're voting A or nay,
Right.
if that wins, then you get a point.
Right. So it's interesting, right? Being on the winning side,
Right.
right, by itself.
But more importantly, being on the winning side in which you have chosen the sides.
Right, because the side that you vote for, and maybe even getting extra points if you're the one that called the vote, right? But just being but the other one is actually, I think, pretty easy, because now that you mention it, these, as we do peer evaluations, in our department,
Mm-hmm.
right? The oversight committee surely would like to make sure that the people that it's included in these deliberations this time around were good partners for this and could ask you to, rate the other participants on a couple of metrics.
Right.
That would also kind of give you feedback on this stuff, and maybe would also ask you. I really like the idea of making judgments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Asking the player to make judgments, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, a lot of times people think that we shouldn't make judgments because
but we do all the time.
We do all the time, but to me, the idea is. Look, I make a lot of judgments, but they're always kind of tentative judgments, right? This is what I think right now. I've been teaching contemporary moral issues now for almost 20 years, and I've flip-flopped on a bunch of those issues.
I'm sure.
Because to me, I'm still kind of always looking for insight that people have, but you still got to make a judgment. You still got to kind of make a decision, and you can learn from making a judgment if you get feedback on that judgment, right, of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even if
That's
that
right.
feedback is, you suck, this is idiotic, here's why, right?
Right.
The here's why part is valuable.
Right. Okay. And I think that we have built that into the premise with this idea of the media coming back and having. And I think there's another element of feedback too, which is the popularity of this fictional social media for which we work.
Right. So we have the media, though it's interesting, right? Because of course we're trying to do a simulation, and you can simulate the media fairly well because there's always going to be different voices in the media, and you can amplify which ones. But it's questionable how much you can simulate what the actual netizens of Facebook or something like that.
This is enormously. This is doable. This is absolutely doable.
Oh, sure, it's doable, but it's contestable, right?
Well, sure, but we don't need to contest it.
Sure. Okay. Right. It's just
we're just saying. What I'm saying is that you make a decision, and then a week of data goes by, and we find out if your decision made the website more or less popular.
Okay. Now here's what I would think would be the point, right? We can do that, but that by itself shouldn't mean anything.
It doesn't.
Right.
I don't think it means anything at all.
But it can be used, right, for questions to reflect on. Was this worth it to make the site more or less popular? Right. Which again, especially if we connect it to the fiduciary responsibility also to make money or things like that, right? But was it worth it? You're asking for another judgment.
That's right.
I'm also thinking of games like Peacemaker. Peacemaker, fantastic game that essentially it's a political game that asks you to make peace between. Your job is to make peace between Israel and Palestine. And as I say this, we've got a war right now happening, brewing, right?
And honestly, we've had 35 years of trying to make this happen, and the brightest minds of the generations working on this. And
we're on 70 years now.
70 years,
You're
yeah.
Right.
So,
but the game itself is really so. The game took maybe the most intractable, most difficult. If I don't know how things are going to be with Taiwan, right? But political problem in the world, and puts you in the position of trying to be a peacemaker.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it's making all these assumptions about what the world is really like and what really would bring about peace. So it's really interesting and really educational. But at the end of the day, people who disagree with it say, "Look, it just started with false assumptions." And we don't.
I think that's why we wanted to do this in a fictional world,
right?
In a fictional and analogous world, because then a population of people that we decide feels a certain way. We can just decide.
Right. And we want to make sure, but we don't want to presume that part is also analogous to the real world population.
Right. We're not going to say this group of people represents the Palestinians, and so therefore we're speaking for them. We're just going to say, it's Wakanda, it's
Sure.
Latveria, it's not
Right.
Latvia, it's Latveria, and the Latverian people. You're right.
Right. So in this case, this is just our not Facebook, but whatever we are, right? Our social media, and the real Facebook, their participants might treat this issue very different. Here's what our people did. What do we think about that? We're going to make a judgment about that.
That's right. All right. Well, I think we have enough to make I could make a one sheet for this game. I think it would be an exciting game to make.
Cool. I'd definitely play a game like this. I'd love to try out something like this.
Yeah. I mean, we play as, I'm just going to recap it.
Okay.
Each player plays as a member of a council on a fictional social media site in a fictional planet Earth. And the game starts, you're just in one country and you're a small social media site, but the site grows as the game progresses. And so you start in a very homogenous sort of society. And so everything's pretty easy, but then you start to grow, you realize that the questions get more complicated as you get more cultures involved in the social media, and the questions get more obscure, and things you would never have expected when you started the game will start to show up on your plate as questions to decide. And you're setting policy for this, setting the social policy for this the social media site, and as you play, other people are playing. You're playing. It's a multiplayer game. You're playing on servers with like a very limited number of players, like 12 players at a time. You sign up for a server and you play until you don't like to play anymore, and then you leave and somebody else takes your place, and which simulates the real life, comings and goings of people into these job positions. Yeah, I think this is a great idea.
Cool. I love it. This was fun. I want to do this again.
It's funny because the idea that I didn't want to present an idea to you. I wanted to let something organically come up from between us, but it's similar to that. So the idea that I thought of as I was working on this was in a fantasy world, you are a traveling ethicist moving from town to town, and every town you go to has a problem, right? And they need your help solving.
Right. I'm like The Witcher, but for moral monsters.
Right, for moral monsters, right?
Yes.
And you go to a town and you have to talk to all these different people to find out all the different information about this surrounding this issue that they're having, right. And then they're asking you to make a decision, and then the results of your decision result in whether or not you're ever asked back to that town again.
Oh man, why don't we do this another time? Let's do it. There's plenty we can do with that.
We could do, there's so much. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for these kinds of games.
Yeah. Oh man, to me, there's a million issues where, here we thought about, Facebook. There's a million issues. I'd love to do more of these where we just kind of focus an issue, think of what might work, explore different possibilities, and just come up with an idea like this together.
Well, super fun.
All right. Good podcast, GP.
Good podcast.
All right. Play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.